The first clue was not something investigators found broken. It was everything that remained intact. On the evening of March 22, 2024, a young woman returned to the apartment she shared with two other students near Timișoara's North Railway Station. The front door was unlocked. She stepped into the dim hallway and saw something on the floor, a dark red trail. It continued through the apartment and led toward one of the bedrooms. Inside, on the bed, was her roommate, 21-year-old medical student Andreea Mihaela Morega. Within minutes, the building was surrounded by police. Officers secured the apartment and restricted access while forensic teams moved through the rooms, documenting what had been left behind. The interior was in disarray. In the bedroom, the signs of a violent physical struggle were impossible to miss. But outside that secured building, almost nobody knew what had actually happened. Fragments of information began moving through student group chats. A young woman had been killed. The attacker had not been caught. Maybe that person was still near the railway station. Maybe other students were in danger. None of those warnings had been verified, but fear rarely waits for confirmation. Across the university community, people became afraid to go outside. What had begun inside one apartment suddenly felt like a threat hanging over an entire part of the city. And at first, investigators could not tell them much. There was no obvious motive. The object used in the attack had not been recovered at the scene. Andreea was known as a serious, high-performing medical student. There were no publicly known enemies and no immediate reason why a stranger would have selected her. So the first theory almost writes itself, doesn't it? Someone entered the building looking for money or valuables. Andreea happened to be alone. She surprised the intruder, or the intruder surprised her, and the encounter turned violent. It was possible. Then investigators examined the entrance. The lock was intact. There were no scratches suggesting that tools had been inserted into it. The hinges had not been damaged. The frame showed no evidence that the door had been forced open. Nothing at the entrance suggested that anyone had fought their way inside. That changed the shape of the case. Andreea had been alone in the apartment while her roommates were away. That meant access was not just another detail. It was the first meaningful filter investigators had. Think about the two possibilities created by that undamaged lock. The first was that Andreea had opened the door herself. If so, the person outside probably did not frighten her. She recognized them, trusted them, or at least had no reason to believe that letting them in would place her in danger. The second possibility was even narrower. Perhaps the visitor never needed Andreea to open the door at all. Maybe that person already had a key, or was so accustomed to entering the apartment that walking through its front door would have seemed completely ordinary. Either way, the intact entrance made a random burglary or street attack increasingly difficult to explain. An unknown offender could still have found an unlocked door by chance, of course. But investigators could not build a case around chance when the physical scene was pointing somewhere much closer. The threat students imagined moving through the neighborhood might never have come from the neighborhood, so detectives shifted their attention away from strangers near the railway station. They began looking at Andreea's personal circle, her university connections, and everyone linked to the apartment itself. Who knew when the roommates would be gone? Who knew Andreea might be there alone? And who could enter without causing her to react? That is the part that gets me. We usually think of a locked door as the boundary between danger and safety. But this door did not appear to have failed. No one had defeated it. Whoever reached Andreea probably did not need to force a way inside. Investigators began listing the people who could walk through that door without alarming anyone. One name was tied not only to the apartment, but to both of Andreea's roommates. Before Andreea became the center of a criminal case, she was the only daughter of a family that had built its hopes around her future. She was 21 years old, a daughter, a friend, a third-year medical student. And if we begin with the apartment, the police tape, and the evidence markers, it becomes far too easy to lose sight of the life that existed before any of those things were there. Andreea Mihaela Morega came from southwestern Romania. Reports connect her family to the Baia de Arama and Pădeș area, a largely rural part of the country made up of small communities where families tend to know one another. Early coverage did not always describe her hometown consistently, but the larger picture is clear. Andreea had left a close-knit place far from Timișoara to pursue an opportunity that demanded almost everything she had. Her destination was the Victor Babeș University of Medicine and Pharmacy, one of Romania's established medical schools. Getting there meant passing a demanding admissions process. Staying there meant years of lectures, examinations, clinical work, and hospital training. Medicine was not simply a course she had chosen. It shaped her schedule and her future. She had moved hundreds of kilometers from her family into a large university city where rent, transportation, food, textbooks, and everyday expenses all added up. To make that life manageable, Andreea shared the apartment near the North Railway Station with 2 other students. 3 young women divided the available rooms and split the cost. It was a practical arrangement, the kind thousands of students make every year. Nothing about it should have placed her in danger. Her father, Adrian, worked to ensure that his only daughter could concentrate on her education without carrying the full financial burden herself. For Andrea's family, her place at medical school represented more than academic success. It was the future they had helped her build. One exam, one payment, and one journey back to Timișoara at a time. And then there are the photographs. They restore the parts of her life that court records never can. In some, Andreea is dressed for formal occasions. In others, she is traveling or spending time outdoors. There is a family Christmas, the familiar kind of picture taken because everyone happens to be together. And there are photographs with her father. Those images matter. They show an ordinary young woman living between 2 worlds, the demanding life she was creating in Timișoara and the family home she continued to return to. Adrian was not someone who heard from his daughter only when she needed money or help. Father and daughter spoke every day. Every day. No exceptions. She told him about lectures, hospital shifts, and the small plans that fill a student's week. These were not formal check-ins. They were part of the rhythm of their relationship. A call home. An update. A conversation about what had happened that day and what she intended to do next. That week, Andreea already had a plan. She intended to take an inner-city bus home for the weekend. Her family was expecting her. She had studies to continue, clinical responsibilities to return to, and a trip she had already discussed. So when she stopped answering on March 22nd, her silence did not fit any version of Andreea that Adrian knew. Think about that for a second. One unanswered call can mean almost anything. A phone on silent, a lecture running late, a dead battery. But when someone has called every day, when she has told you where she is going and when she plans to come home, repeated silence begins to feel different. It becomes a break in a pattern. Adrian called again. And again. There was still no answer. He knew his daughter was responsible. He knew she would not casually abandon her studies, disappear in an unfamiliar city, or ignore the family waiting for her without a word. The missed calls were not a vague reason for concern. Because their daily contact had been so consistent, the silence itself became evidence that something was wrong. But while Adrian was still trying to reach his daughter, the person with the easiest access to her apartment had already begun putting distance between himself and Timișoara. Mirel Dragomir did not enter Andreea's world as an obvious threat. He arrived through people she lived with and behind a reputation that appeared almost impossible to question. Mirel Dragomir was 23, a student from the Possessiveness area of Karaš-Severin County. His connection to Andreea's apartment was direct. One of her roommates was reportedly his sister. The other was his cousin. So when Mirel visited, nobody treated him like a stranger. He was there to see family. He could walk through the front door without attracting attention or giving anyone a reason to be concerned. That matters, because trust is not always built one conversation at a time. Sometimes it is inherited from the people around you. If your roommates know someone, if he is part of their family, his presence can feel safe before you really know him at all. And Mirel's background only reinforced that impression. His father was reportedly a respected priest in their local community, and Mirel had been raised in a strict religious environment. Acquaintances and fellow students described him as quiet, polite, and deeply devout. He did not have a public reputation for confrontation. On the surface, he seemed disciplined and academically driven. In fact, he was pursuing studies in 2 demanding fields, medicine and theology. Think about the image that creates. A young man preparing to work in medicine while also studying religion. The son of a priest, reserved, courteous, ambitious. To the people around him, those details did not suggest danger. They suggested responsibility. But investigators would later hear a very different account from his hometown. During unofficial conversations, several local residents reportedly claimed that Mirel had been involved in a previous relationship before leaving for university, and that he had physically assaulted that girlfriend when the relationship deteriorated. Those allegations require caution. No official complaint was filed, and the reported incident did not produce a criminal case. According to the accounts that later emerged, the young woman believed she would not be supported if she spoke publicly against the son of a respected local priest, so nothing was formally established. There was no prosecution and no official record that could have warned the people Mirel met in Timișoara. If the reports were accurate, the behavior remained hidden while his public image stayed intact. Then, around October 2023, Mirel began growing closer to Andreea. They moved through overlapping university circles, and he regularly saw her during visits to the apartment. At first, the courtship reportedly appeared ordinary. They spent time together between lectures and demanding study schedules. Mirel seemed patient and attentive. There was no single dramatic moment that announced what the relationship might become. The change was gradual. His interest reportedly shifted into repeated questioning. He wanted access to Andreea's phone, her passwords, her private messages, and her contacts. He wanted to know who was speaking to her, what they were saying, and who she communicated with when he was not present. That is not proof of affection. It is surveillance. And when one partner demands the right to inspect another person's private conversations, the issue is no longer simply jealousy. It becomes coercive control. The attempt to reduce someone else's independence by monitoring their choices, contacts, and movements. Andreea was not responsible for calming that behavior or finding the perfect way to manage it. Her privacy did not become negotiable because Mirel felt insecure. The demands led to recurring arguments. Andreea became increasingly uncomfortable with having to explain messages, conversations, and activity on her phone. Yet outside the relationship, Mirel reportedly presented a completely different version of what was happening. To friends and relatives, he described the relationship as stable and happy. He even spoke about the possibility of marriage. Andreea did not. When talking to her family, she avoided describing Mirel as an official partner. Her father understood him to be a friend connected to her roommates. Whatever Mirel believed, or wanted others to believe, Andreea was already pulling away. The relationship that appeared promising in his version had become intrusive in hers. By the final days of March, she had made a decision. She wanted to end contact, leave Timișoara for the weekend, and return to the safety of her family home. Friday, March 22nd, was supposed to be the day she ended the relationship and went home. Instead, her father received the one thing he had never received from her before: silence. Andreea Morega did not wait for someone to tell him that enough time had passed. He got into his car and started driving. On March 22nd, call after call to his daughter went unanswered. For another parent, that silence might have meant a dead battery, a lecture running late, or a phone left at the bottom of a bag. But Adrian knew Andrea's routine. They spoke every day. No exceptions. She told him about classes, hospital training, and ordinary plans that might seem insignificant to anyone else. And she was supposed to return home that weekend. So when Andreea suddenly stopped responding, Adrian did not see a minor break in routine. He saw a warning. She was responsible, consistent, and alone in a city far from her family. Simply disappearing from contact made no sense. He left immediately, heading toward Timișoara. But roughly an hour and a half into the drive, as he reached Bale Herculane, a practical problem became impossible to ignore. Even if he drove all the way to the city, what then? He did not know where to begin. He could not search hundreds of unfamiliar streets by himself. He did not know which hospitals to call first, which doors to knock on, or who might have seen her last. So Adrian pulled over outside a local police station, walked inside, and asked officers to start looking for his daughter. And this is where a frightened father collided with procedure. The officers in Bale Herculane faced a jurisdictional limit. Andreea did not live there. She was not registered in their area, and her disappearance had no direct connection to that locality. That meant they could not formally handle the report in the usual way. On paper, the distinction was straightforward. Standing in front of them, though, was a father saying that his only daughter had broken a daily pattern she never broke. One employee decided not to leave the matter there. She used her personal phone and called an officer she knew in Timișoara. This was not yet a formal investigative breakthrough. She was simply trying to obtain some information. anything that might calm Adrian down or point him toward the right authorities. Instead, the answer confirmed his fear. An investigative team was already inside the apartment. Officials initially told Adrian very little. They also advised him not to drive directly to the address. The scene was still active, the circumstances were deeply disturbing, and no one wanted him arriving without preparation and seeing what investigators were documenting inside. So he was left in that terrible space between knowing that something had happened and not yet being told the full truth. Think about that for a second. He had recognized the danger from silence alone. Now strangers were carefully choosing which words he was ready to hear. Back in Timișoara, the investigation was moving quickly. Forensic teams had already established that the apartment door showed no signs of forced entry. Now detectives needed to know who had approached the building during the critical period around the time Andreea stopped communicating. They began gathering recordings from every available surveillance camera, not only from the apartment building, but also from nearby intersections. The goal was to reconstruct movement through the area and identify every person who had entered or left within that window. Hours of footage can produce dozens of irrelevant faces: residents coming home, students leaving for class, delivery workers passing through. Investigators had to separate all of that ordinary traffic from the one movement that mattered. Then they saw someone familiar. The cameras showed Mirel Dragomir leaving the building. He was not wandering out casually or lingering near the entrance. He was moving quickly, with an urgency that suggested he wanted distance between himself and the apartment. At first, that footage made him someone investigators urgently needed to question. He knew Andreea. He regularly visited the apartment. He could enter without attracting attention, and the cameras placed him there during the period they were trying to reconstruct. Detectives attempted to contact him. His relatives, gathered outside the secured scene, called him too. Nothing. His phone could not be reached. And with every failed attempt, the meaning of the footage changed. Mirel was no longer simply a familiar visitor who might provide information about Andreea's final hours. He became the leading suspect in an active regional search. The cameras had given investigators what the undamaged door could not: the identity of a familiar visitor leaving during the critical period. The search was no longer for an unknown intruder. But to understand what the footage had captured him fleeing, investigators had to move backward several hours, to a bedroom, a refused demand for a phone, and a final answer Mirel would not accept. The confrontation reportedly began with a single word: no. Andreea would not surrender her phone, and she would not continue the relationship. What happened inside the apartment around midday was not independently witnessed from beginning to end. The sequence investigators later presented was reconstructed from the crime scene, forensic evidence, surveillance footage, and Mirel Dragomir's own account. That distinction matters. We know the conclusions reached by investigators. We do not have Andreea's voice to tell us what those final minutes were like. According to the reconstructed timeline, Andreea had finished showering and returned to her bedroom. Mirel was already inside the apartment, waiting for her. Once again, he demanded access to her phone. He wanted to inspect her messages and see who she had been speaking to. But this time, she did not try to calm him down or postpone the argument. She refused. Then she made the larger decision clear. The relationship was over. She wanted no further contact. Think about how ordinary those words should have been. A relationship ends. One person says no. The other person leaves. Investigators concluded that Mirel did leave the bedroom, but not the apartment. He walked toward the kitchen. What happened in the brief interval that followed became central to the question running through this case. Was the violence an immediate, uncontrolled response to rejection, or did Mirel use those moments to prepare for what came next? When he returned, the confrontation became physical. Andreea resisted. The evidence in the room showed that this was not a passive or one-sided encounter in which she had no chance to react. She fought to protect herself, and during that struggle, Mirel sustained a fresh injury to the right side of his face. The cut left a distinct mark across his cheek. That detail would matter almost immediately. The man captured, leaving the building on surveillance footage, had a visible facial injury. The same mark would later be seen after Mirel was taken into custody and during his first court appearance. On its own, a cut cannot reconstruct an entire crime. But here, it supported the investigators' account of close physical contact and connected the person on camera to Andreea's resistance inside the bedroom. The forensic findings documented an attack concentrated around her face, neck, and upper body. Later court reporting placed the total at 51 knife wounds. There is no need to recreate those injuries one by one. The number tells us what matters. This was not a single movement in one confused second. It was an extended and extreme assault. Evidence also indicated that at least one knife was damaged during the attack. And even after that weapon broke, the violence continued. Then investigators searched Mirel's belongings. Inside his backpack, they reportedly discovered a broken fragment from one of the knives. Beside it was a pair of tightly fitted surgical gloves. And that is where the claim of a purely spontaneous outburst became much more difficult to accept without question. To be careful, those objects do not prove premeditation by themselves. Mirel was a medical student, so the presence of surgical gloves was not automatically inexplicable. A broken blade fragment could also have been collected after the confrontation. Evidence has to be considered as part of a full sequence, not treated like a shortcut to motive. Still, look at the sequence investigators were examining. Mirel came to the apartment. He demanded access to Andrea's private communications. She ended the relationship. He reportedly walked toward the kitchen. A knife was used with such force that it became damaged. A fragment later appeared in his backpack beside fitted gloves. Was every part of that sequence improvised? Or had the word no simply triggered something for which he was already prepared? What reportedly happened after the attack complicated that question even further. Investigators said Mirel did not immediately run from the room in blind panic. He remained beside the bed for a period of time. Then he adjusted Andrea's hair, arranging it to conceal some of the visible injuries around her neck. That is a controlled action. Quiet. Deliberate. And for me, it is one of the most disturbing details in the entire timeline. Not because it answers the question of advance planning, but because it suggests that once the violence stopped, he still understood the scene in front of him and made a choice about how it should look. Only then did he gather his belongings. He walked out of the bedroom, entered the hallway, and left the apartment behind. Outside, the building's surveillance system recorded him moving away with that fresh injury still visible on his right cheek. By then, the physical evidence had established an extended attack, and Andrea's resistance had left an identifying mark on the man seen leaving the scene. The gloves and broken blade fragment did not settle the question of intent on their own, but they made the word spontaneous far harder to accept without question. Mirel then drove more than 90 miles toward his family's home. By the time police traced the route, he had already told his relatives a version of what happened. He did not cross the border or disappear into the countryside. Near midnight, officers found him sitting in a parked car close to his family's home. By then, roughly 12 hours had passed since Andreea was killed. After leaving the apartment, Mirel Dragomir drove south from Timișoara toward the Possessiveness area, more than 90 miles away. Investigators worked backward from surveillance footage, tracing the likely route of the car and circulating alerts to law enforcement units across the region. They knew whom they were looking for. They knew where his family lived. And they knew that every hour gave him more time to move again. But Mirel's journey did not end at a border crossing or in some isolated hiding place. It brought him back to the community where he had grown up, the place where his father was known as a priest and where the Dragomir family had spent years building a respected name. According to investigators, Mirel went into the family home and told his relatives what had happened. Imagine hearing that from someone you raised. At first, the family reportedly could not accept it. The claim seemed so far removed from the quiet, polite, deeply religious student they believed they knew that they treated it as a possible misunderstanding. Perhaps the facts were confused. Perhaps something had happened, but not what Mirel appeared to be admitting. Then the story began appearing in national news reports. A young medical student had been found dead in a Timișoara apartment. Police were searching for a man connected to her. Details from the scene were beginning to circulate. What Mirel had told them could no longer be pushed aside as an impossible story or an account distorted by panic. The reports coming from Timișoara were catching up with him. His relatives reportedly urged him to stop avoiding the authorities and cooperate. That decision matters. There was no dramatic pursuit through the countryside, no armed confrontation. When officers located him inside a vehicle near the family home, he did not physically resist. He was taken into custody, placed in a police vehicle, and transported back to Timișoara for questioning. And when investigators finally saw him in person, One piece of evidence was already visible on his face. A fresh injury marked his right cheek. On its own, a cut proves very little. But evidence does not exist on its own. Investigators considered that injury alongside the disorder inside Andrea's room, the signs of a close physical struggle, and evidence that she had fought back. They also had surveillance footage showing Mirel leaving the building quickly after the attack, followed by his drive away from the city and the sudden loss of contact with those trying to reach him. Put together, those details formed a sequence. Mirel had been inside the apartment. Andreea resisted. He left with a fresh wound. Cameras captured his departure. Hours later, police found him near his family's home after he had reportedly disclosed what happened to his relatives. During questioning, Mirel admitted responsibility for the attack. But an admission is not the same thing as the end of a criminal case. It answers one question: who did it? While leaving several legal questions unresolved. What had he intended? How should the offense be classified? Were there aggravating circumstances? And, ultimately, what punishment did Romanian law allow? Before the court could reach those questions, it had to address another one. Had Mirel understood what he was doing? A forensic psychiatric assessment was ordered. Specialists examined him to determine whether he had been aware of his conduct during the attack and whether he could be held criminally responsible for it. In plain language, the distinction was crucial. A person who experiences a complete break from reality may not understand the nature or consequences of an act. If experts had reached that conclusion, the case could have been handled very differently, potentially shifting the focus from an ordinary prison sentence towards psychiatric treatment or another form of legal supervision. That was not what the medical panel found. Its conclusion was clear. Mirel had remained aware of his actions and was legally competent. The experts did not identify a mental state that had left him unable to understand what he was doing. That finding left little room for a defense built around a complete loss of contact with reality. So within hours, investigators had their suspect. They had surveillance footage, an injury consistent with a close struggle, evidence that Andreea had resisted, and Mirel's own admission. The psychiatric assessment then added one more conclusion. He understood his actions. The central courtroom fight would not be over whether Andreea was dead or whether Mirel had attacked her. It would be over how the law should name what he had done, and how many years of his life it should cost. When the trial began in February 2025, the defense did not center its case on an apology. It began searching for legal and medical routes to reduce the consequences. Almost 11 months had passed since Andreea's death when Mirel Dragomir entered the Timișoara County judicial system as a defendant. He had admitted responsibility during questioning. For many people, that created an expectation that the courtroom might finally hear some expression of remorse. An apology. An acknowledgement of what Andreea's parents had lost. Instead, the defense focused on detention conditions, the legal classification of the offense, and the number of years Mirel might ultimately serve. First came a claim involving his health. Mirel said he had a long-standing cardiac condition and referred to a procedure performed when he was a child. His lawyers argued that remaining in detention could place his health at risk and asked the court to replace custody with house arrest. The request was denied. Then came a motion that was much harder for Andreea's family to hear. The defense requested an additional medical examination to establish as precisely as possible when she had died during the attack. The reasoning was not that this would change who was responsible. The argument was that if Andreea had died earlier in the sequence, then her suffering had lasted for a shorter period, and that this should count in Mirel's favor when the sentence was decided. Think about what that meant in practical terms. The court was being asked to measure a young woman's final suffering and then use the result to negotiate down the punishment of the person who caused it. The defense also tried to have the offense reclassified. If the court removed the aggravating factors and accepted a lesser legal category, the potential sentence could have moved closer to 20 years. But the prosecution's case was not built around one isolated moment of anger. It rested on the full sequence: the extreme violence of the attack, the forensic findings inside the apartment, the broken knife fragment recovered from Mirel's backpack, and the tightly fitted surgical gloves found beside it. There was also his conduct afterward. Remaining at the scene long enough to arrange Andreea's hair over injuries to her neck, collecting his belongings, leaving the building, disconnecting his phone, and driving toward Possessiveness. And then there was the psychiatric assessment. Court-appointed specialists had concluded that Mirel was legally competent and fully aware of his actions. They did not find that he had lost contact with reality or become incapable of understanding what he was doing. That finding mattered. It left little room to frame the killing as an act committed by someone who could not comprehend its consequences, and it brought the central question back into focus. Were the gloves and broken blade evidence of preparation, or did the intention to kill emerge only after Andreea refused to surrender her phone and ended the relationship? The court ultimately rejected the attempts to secure a lesser outcome. Mirel Dragomir received 25 years in prison, described in reporting on the case as the maximum punishment available for the offense as classified. He was also ordered to pay 100,000 euros in moral damages to Andreea's parents and reimburse the full cost of her funeral. But even that was not final. The initial judgment remained subject to appeal, and later in 2025, Mirel continued trying to reduce his sentence. For Andreea's family, that meant more filings, more hearings, and more occasions on which the worst day of their lives became a legal argument again. The public mourning had begun long before the verdict. On March 25, 2024, just days after the killing, Andreea's classmates gathered outside the Timișoara Institute of Forensic Medicine. They brought candles and flowers. The people standing there remembered a medical student with a future, not simply the victim described in police reports. Andreea was eventually taken home. Following a local tradition for young unmarried women, she was buried in a white wedding dress. At the Morega family home, time appears to have stopped around the life she expected to return to. Her laptop reportedly remains where she left it. Her books and personal belongings have not been moved. Her room is still waiting for someone who will not walk through the door. And Andreea Morega still pays his daughter's cell phone bill every month. He understands that no call is coming. He knows the number will never again connect him to the daily conversations they once shared. But disconnecting it would mean choosing one more ending, and he cannot bring himself to do that. The court answered the question of punishment: 25 years, financial damages, and an appeal that kept the process alive. It could not answer the question left behind in that apartment. Did the gloves, the knife fragment, and Mirel's deliberate conduct after the attack reveal advanced preparation? Or did the final decision form only in the moments after Andreea said no? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want more carefully documented true crime stories, subscribe to the channel. For now, Andreea's number remains active. A silent line her father knows will not bring another call, but still cannot disconnect.